the first reading is Psalm 138. I give you thanks, O Lord, with my whole heart. Before the gods I sing your praise. I bow down toward your holy temple and give thanks to your name for your steadfast love and your faithfulness. For you have exalted your name and your word above everything. On the day I called, you answered me. You increased my strength of soul. All the kings of the earth shall praise you, O Lord, for they have heard the words of your mouth. They shall sing of the ways of the Lord, for great is the glory of the Lord. Sorry, I'm doing it. That's what's going on.
Hang on. You do it. I'll hand it over to you.
I'm capable to go to a new screen. For though the Lord is high, he regards the lowly, but the haughty he perceives from far away. Though I walk in the midst of trouble, you preserve me against the wrath of my enemies. You stretch out your hand, and your right hand delivers me. The Lord will fulfill his purpose for me. Your steadfast love, O Lord, endures forever. Do not forsake the work of your hands. And the New Testament reading is from Luke 5, 1-11. Once, while Jesus was standing beside the lake of Gennesaret, and the crowd was pressing in on him to hear the word of God, he saw two boats there at the shore of the lake. The fishermen had gone out of them and were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to pull out a little way from the shore. Then he sat down and taught the crowds from the boat. When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Simon answered, "Master, we have worked all night long, but have caught nothing. Yet if you say so, I will let down the nets." When they had done this, they caught so many fish that their nets were beginning to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats, so that they began to sink. But when Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Go away from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." For he and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish they had taken. And so also were James and John, sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching people." When they had brought their boats to shore, they left everything and followed him. This is the word of the Lord.
Our next song is "This Day God Gives Me." It's a familiar tune, and the words are words from a very ancient poem. Thank you. I'm not sure that's the tune.
It's the song before.
This Day God Gives Me. Yep. What's that? As we contemplate. Oh gosh. Hang on. Could be my bad. Sorry. No, I put the wrong thing in my place. Try again. Let's see. Yes, this is the one. We'll sing this one now. That's good. Good. My bad. As we contemplate the future, as we look beyond today, many fruitful thoughts and feelings enter us along the way. One grips us, it torments us. Fear controls, restraints, imprisons, binds the spirit, rules the mind. Fear forbids the no insight, causes gloom, misleads the blind. In God's love is perfect freedom, we can live out His kingdom. Jesus shows us in His person, God's own love revealed so clear. Love is present, God is with us, not to punish, not to be. He displays God's loving nature, and love comes out of Him. Like the birds released from cages, soaring to great heights unknown. Like the growth and life exploding when the tiny seed is sown. Courage blossoms on the sea when God's love is felt and known. Okay, thank you. Story today is Dr. Seuss one. The theme today sort of addresses our theme today, which is a bit about fear. Not just fear of putting the him in the wrong place. It's the most common thing that happens to me. I don't know why. No, it's all good. What was I scared of? Well, I was walking in the night and I saw nothing scary, for I have never been afraid of anything, not very. Then I was deep within the woods when suddenly I spied them. I saw a pair of pale green pants with nobody inside them. I wasn't scared, but yet I stopped. What could those pants be there for? What could a pair of pants at night be standing in the air for? It's typical Dr. Seuss form. And then they moved, those empty pants. They kind of started jumping. And then my heart, I must admit, it kind of started thumping. So I got out fast as I could go, sir. I wasn't scared, but pants like that I did not care for. No, sir. After that, a week went by. Then one dark night in Greenwich, I had to do an errand there and fetch some Greenwich spinach. While I had fetched the spinach, I was starting back through town when those pants raced round a corner and they almost knocked me down. Lost my Greenwich spinach, but I didn't even care. I ran for home, believe me. I really had a scare. Now, bicycles were never made for pale green pants to ride them, especially spooky pale green pants with nobody inside them. And the next night I was fishing for doubt trite on River River when those pants came rowing toward me. Well, I began to shiver. And by now I was so frightened that I'll tell you, but I hate to. I screamed and rode away and lost my hook and line, bait too. I ran and found a brickle bush and hid myself away. I got brickles in my breeches, but I stayed there anyway. Stayed all night. The next night too. I'd be there still, no doubt, but I had to do an errand, so the next night I went out. I had to do an errand. I had to pick a peck of snide in a dark and gloomy snide field that was almost 9 miles wide. I said, I do not fear those pants with nobody inside them. I said those words, I said them, but I lied them. Then I reached inside a snide bush, and the next thing that I knew, I felt my hand touch someone, and I'll bet that you know who. And there I was, caught in the snide, and in that dreadful place, those spooky empty pants and I were standing face to face, so to speak. I yelled for help. I screamed, I shrieked, I howled, I yelled, I cried, I save me from those pale green pants with nobody inside. Then a strange thing happened. Why, those pants began to cry. Those pants began to tremble. They were just as scared as I. I never heard such whimpering, and I began to see that I was just as strange to them as they were strange to me. I put my arm around their waist and sat right down beside them. I calmed them down. Poor empty pants with nobody inside them. And now we meet quite often, those empty pants and I, and we never shake or tremble. We both smile and we say, "Hi." Our reading today is about a lot of things. I mean, there's lots of stuff come out of this particular reading. Sunday school songs. Do you remember a Sunday school song that might have come from this one, from this reading? If you remember the one. Who went to Sunday school? I will make you fishers of men. Yeah, this one. It's one of those weird sort of stories that is in the Bible. Just to recap it, certainly in Sunday school you didn't really recount the weirdness of it, but here we had Jesus who was preaching to the crowds, and at this stage was before he had the disciples, so he's preaching there by himself. And the story has it that he got so crowded in and so close to the river or to the lake that he couldn't go any further, and he needed some personal space or preaching space. He saw a couple of empty boats, as you do. Thought, beauty, I'll hop in one of those. That'll stop the crowds. They'll be able to have to keep at a distance from me. So he just picks one and hops in it. No buy your leave. No asking anybody if it's okay if I use your boat. Meanwhile, apparently the disciples, a couple of the disciples who weren't yet disciples, Peter in particular, were there, and they had been they were mending their nets after a terrible night of no fish. How many of you have been fishing in your life at all? Yep. How many of you have been fishing in your life and been ages and ages without catching a fish? For me, it amounts to years. And I often console myself that, which is true, that it's lovely that's an excuse to sit there by the banks of a river or, a lake and just soak in the stillness. Makes it seem like a very spiritual task, which I think there is an aspect of, but you still get disappointed. The disciples were shattered, really, because they had not had any fish. And yeah, you've got this little really lovely encounter between Simon, in which after Jesus has taught the crowds from the boat, he says to Simon, because he's noticed that they haven't caught anything, "Put out into the deep water and let down your nets for a catch." Now, Simon's reply here is, well, I've only ever read it flat. I reckon it's sarcastic. "Master, we've worked all night and caught nothing. Yep, if you say so, I will let down the nets." So they did. They did as Jesus said. They caught so many fish the nets were beginning to break, and they signalled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats, and there were so many fish that they began to sink. This is another thing I like about this reading, this story. It's well, I like the fact that it's really a human story, because I think some of the text actually gives away some of the humanity involved in it, and it's it's really rich in that way. I love the fact that this is another story about abundance in the Gospels. At its root, it's about God giving abundance to the people. Now, reread in the later church, and as I was taught coming through theological school, taught this is all about, the disciples are going to make a really big church for themselves. But I think at root, actually, it's just about a lot of fish. It's about Jesus and God providing not just enough, but too much. And when you set it in the background of the context of the day, they were, of course, under Roman rule, but what I read this week is that there was a tax on everything. And the fishermen were no exception. They would go out and fish, and a huge proportion of their fish, of their catch, would be taken from them as a tax. So, in a way, this huge catch is a liberation for them. It has a political aspect. They are liberated by the abundance that God provides. It sits in other abundant stories that we have in the Bible. Yep, I'm going to ask you, what other abundant stories do we have from Jesus? Feeding 5,000. Yep, several times. Yep. It's one that yeah, that's the one I was fishing. That's the one I was fishing for. Boom, boom. Yes, exactly. Jesus begins his ministry with this story about the abundance that God provides. And that's a pattern, I think, that goes through his ministry and the lessons that he seeks to teach. Interesting thing that happens then, because when Simon Peter sees this miracle, what does he do? How does he react? Yeah, get away from me, you nasty man, he says to Jesus. Get away, you're too holy for me. And he sort of falls on his feet and he's petrified at this show of abundance, this show of, I guess, the power that Jesus has in one way, but just overcome by the moment. So there he is, falling down at Jesus' knees. And I can imagine Jesus wouldn't be too pleased at that, because he'd already tried to get some personal space with the boat, and here he is, someone grabbing at his knees. And Jesus says to Simon in particular, he says, don't be afraid. And that sentence stands by itself, doesn't it? How many times in Jesus' ministry does he say, in so many contexts, he says it, in his teaching and his relationship to Peter, and even after his resurrection, one of the first things he says is, don't be afraid. And then he gives a reason for saying, don't be afraid. He says, for I will make you, you'll be catching people. So, which must have been quite mystifying for Peter, and we don't have Peter's response to that, except we do have one core thing about their response, and it's not just about Peter's response, but those fishermen dropped everything they had and they left everything and followed him. There's another couple of reasons I like this story. I think because I think it tells a story about a bit about how we can be in faith and in our lives. Sometimes I feel like I'm suspended in that gap between fishing for a whole period of time and that abundance. I'm sort of caught between those two things. the gap between weariness and hope, defeat and faith. And though I'm often afraid to admit it, life can be hard, like it was for Peter and the others. And even the most hard-working of us can land up on a shore some mornings with empty, stinking fishing nets tangled in our fingers, wondering what the heck went wrong. And that's a different sort of fear. When I looked at to the Bible and hear the words of Jesus at so many points and read him saying, "Don't be afraid," I think, well, that's okay for you, JC, but it's not always that easy not to be afraid. But as often happens with Jesus' words, when I pause to reflect, I realise that he's doing two things that are important to us in our lives as spiritual beings. Firstly, each time, and here in particular we'll focus on, but each time he says to the disciples, to Peter, "Do not be afraid," he's naming the feeling. He's acknowledging the truth of what is being experienced by Peter. And he's not condemning it. He doesn't say, he's not condemning it. He's just acknowledging its presence and making an invitation to move into a different place. It's a vital thing. I don't think if we can't acknowledge our fears, then we give that extra power over us. I used to think that courage was never being afraid, but as I get older, I realise that true courage is knowing my fears and turning to face them. And don't get me wrong, I'm not always the best at doing that. But even when we do, it doesn't mean that they magically disappear. To take the instance of Jesus and the disciples, he didn't just say to them once, "Don't be afraid." He had to repeatedly ask them, acknowledge their fear and invite them to move into a different place. So secondly, about that, I think Jesus was usually asking the disciples or inviting them not to live in their fear, not to let it be what drives them. As that Lunic poem we referred to last week goes, there are only two motives, two procedures, two results, love and fear. And when Jesus asks us not to be afraid, I think he's asking us not to live out of the fears that we always live with. He saw many people living out of fear, but not being aware of it in their lives. He saw religious leaders living out of fear, and the way that manifested for them was by drawing back to something that felt concrete for them, and that was the law. And Jesus invited them into an open space of love. He saw others having the fear of the stranger, just like the pants with nobody inside them, perhaps. And so Jesus says, don't be afraid. He acknowledges their fear and asks them to see their own fear and not be ruled or motivated by it. Interestingly, as we see in this reading, Peter, overcome by fear and falling on his face after seeing Jesus perform the fishing miracle, and we hear Jesus' response to tell him not to be afraid and tell him that from now on he'll be catching people. I think in that as well, he's saying, in other words, if he can move through his fear, he'll find new strength to love and to grow into his own strengths, the strengths that Jesus always saw in Peter, and I believe God sees in each one of us. So I think this reading is really about that invitation to know that whatever our fears, whatever our anxieties, God acknowledges and lives in that space with us, but invites us to move into a new place. So may we find it in ourselves to befriend our fears, and to move through them to find a new space of meaning and hope. I had to end on the Summer Palace. It sort of says some of that. Make a little garden in your pocket, plant your cuffs with radishes and rocket, Let a passion fruit crawl up your thigh. Grow some oregano in your fly. Make a steamy compost of your own fears. Trickle irrigate your life with tears. Let your troubled mind become a trellis. Turn your heart into a summer palace. Amen. Would be a good time to pass the peace. We don't do it all that often, but I invite you to stand. And a reminder that while we pass the peace here, we don't do the physical touching thing anymore, but we do that, or we can do pass the peace this way.